A Senate hearing today looked into Russian efforts to influence democratic countries through propaganda, cyber attacks, money laundering, and military threats. Witnesses included a former president of Estonia and former state and Homeland Security Department officials. This is 2 hours.
Thank you all. The hearing will come to order, and I appreciate Senator Whitehouse and how we've worked together to get here, and all the subcommittee members who participate. A little housekeeping. I will soon announce our panel and mess your names up, so I apologize. So if I butcher your names, I apologize in advance. We'll do 7-minute rounds. I'll swear in the panel just in a second. But I wanted to kind of make an announcement. We apparently were informed by the FBI just a few minutes ago that they would be responding to our letter, the letter that Senator Whitehouse and myself sent to the Department of Justice and to the Director of the FBI, March 8th, 2017, that they would be responding with a classified briefing, I think, to the chair and ranking member. We'll give you more details as they become available to us. But this letter was a pretty simple request. Was there a warrant issued by any court anywhere in the United States allowing the surveillance of the Trump campaign, Trump Tower, or any Trump operative during the 2016 election? And please provide the information that was used to obtain a warrant. If a warrant was requested and denied, we'd also like to know that. So apparently the FBI has contacted my staff that they will be at some date in the future providing us an answer to this in a classified manner. And with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Whitehouse if he'd like to respond for a second before we move forward.
I think one of the things that we have tried to do here is to proceed outside of a classified setting. The intelligence committees are working in a classified setting. The added value I think that this subcommittee's work provides is to be able to have a public discussion. If a small town wakes up one morning to find that all the shop windows on Main Street have been smashed, it is appropriate, and indeed it is incumbent on the police chief to reassure the town that law enforcement will be looking into that incident. It's even legitimate to say, here are the people I've assigned to it. And it's certainly legitimate to say, and we intend to get to the bottom of this. In my mind, the unclassified intelligence community report is smashed windows all up and down Main Street. And it is now not only appropriate, but incumbent upon law enforcement to say, we are looking at this, we intend to get to the bottom of this, and we have these resources dedicated to accomplishing that purpose. That is an entirely appropriate act for law enforcement in those circumstances. It has added significance when you are dealing within our constitutional separation of powers. It is not, in my view, appropriate for the executive branch of government to either tell or suggest to a legislative investigative subcommittee that they should hold back or not proceed or otherwise restrain themselves in our legitimate investigative function, one which President Wilson years ago said indeed was to be even preferred to our legislative function, in order to not compromise ongoing law enforcement investigations, and at the same time not confirm that law enforcement investigations are ongoing. That is a recipe for having the ball plop between the second baseman and the shortstop. We are entitled to investigate under the Constitution. They have executive responsibilities, and if we are only connecting with one another in a classified fashion, I don't think that serves the public interest. So we will pursue this further, but that's my initial reaction to this news.
And I will just build on that. Senator Grassley and Feinstein, the chair and ranking member of the committee, have been very supportive of this subcommittee. I just talked with Senator Grassley a few minutes ago, and I think there's an attitude on the committee that we need to get answers for the American people appropriately in an appropriate fashion. So what are we trying to do? The current president says that he believes that the former president, maybe not personally, but the former president through the government, surveilled his campaign in 2016. As a matter of fact, today they said they're extremely confident there was some kind of surveillance of the campaign. I have no evidence for that, but I can tell you this. That question needs to be answered because I don't think it's ever been raised before. And the bottom line is a lot of Americans are wondering what's going on here. So what I'm trying to do is get answers to the questions raised by President Trump. He's asking us to investigate, and we will. And to me, it's very reasonable to ask the FBI and Department of Justice, did you ever seek a warrant? Was a warrant obtained from any court anywhere about the Trump campaign? If the answer is no, then we'll know that didn't happen. If the answer is yes, that would be pretty stunning to me because they would have to have probable cause. I don't know what the answer is, but I know it's the right question to ask. The second thing, we met with the director, I think, on March the 8th, and we said, Senator Whitehouse and myself, that we want to know if there's a criminal investigation of the Trump campaign and ties to Russia because we're about to launch an investigation into all things Russia regarding the 2016 election. I don't want to compromise your investigation. I don't want to get in the way of your investigation, but the Congress is proceeding fairly blindly here. I think we would all be better off as a body if we knew that there was an investigation or not. If there's not one, we'll take that into consideration about how we might do things differently. If there is one, we don't want to run afoul of it. I don't think that is an unfair thing to ask. We gave the director until today to answer that question, and all I can say is I still don't have the answers to those questions. I like the director of the FBI, Comey. I think he's a fine man. The Department of Justice has a responsibility here too. So I just want to let the American people know that this subcommittee, with support of the chairman and the ranking committee, that we're going to get an answer to whether or not the Trump campaign was surveilled. Was a warrant ever requested? Was one issued? And I hope to be able to answer the question, is there an active investigation on the criminal side of the Trump campaign regarding ties to Russia? Director of National Intelligence Clapper said a couple of weeks ago that he had no evidence of collaboration between the Trump campaign and Russia. But the best way to find out definitively is to have people in charge today with that responsibility to tell us. And we're going to get there. I don't know how we get there, but we're going to get there together. We're going to do it as Republicans and Democrats. We've got a ranking member and a chairman who support us. Now, the hearing today is to explain to the American people what Russia's up to. Russian officials have been on television pretty fiercely in the last couple of days saying that we, the Congress, are demonizing the Russian government. What I'm trying to explain to the American people that the Russian government in Putin's hands has been up to no good in a lot of places for a long time when it comes to breaking the back of democracy. That what happened here, and I'm convinced that the Russians are involved in hacking into the DNC and Podesta's emails. It wasn't a 400-pound guy sitting on a bed. It was the Russians' intelligence services. I'm confident they shared it with WikiLeaks. And to my Republican colleagues, it could happen to us next. So my goal is to make a case that we're not demonizing Russia, we're exposing what they do in their efforts to break apart democracies all over the world, that we make a case that they should be punished for what happened in 2016 to deter other foreign powers that may want to interfere in future elections. So with that, we have a great panel, and if you would all please rise.
Let me make my statement.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, do the swearing.
Swear, yeah, okay, go ahead. Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give before the committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Now, Senator Whitehouse.
Propaganda, espionage, blackmail, subversion. The 21st century versions of these are fake news, hacking, compromat, and political capture. The Russians have been at this for a long time. They've adapted old methods to new technologies, making use of social media, malware, and complex financial transactions. But the purposes themselves are timeless. Over the course of the last decade, we've seen Russia manipulate the politics of other countries, undermine faith in Western institutions, and attempt to fracture Euro-Atlantic consensus. Last month at the Munich Security Conference, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov didn't mince words about his country's intentions when he looked forward to the creation of a post-West world order. That is a Russia-influenced order that stands opposed both to democratic ideals and free market economies. Senator Graham and I scheduled this hearing to begin a public conversation about the means and methods Russia uses to undermine democratic government. Their toolbox includes cultivating politicians through corrupt business deals and then threatening to expose the illicit arrangements. It includes acquiring control over vital economic sectors like energy to threaten and cajole dependent governments. It includes fake news and social media attacks, often based on network penetrations and the information illegally gathered from them. The declassified intelligence assessment released in January asserts that Russia, quote, ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Senator Graham and I intend to hold public hearings to understand how Russia operates, what objectives it is pursuing, how those objectives may threaten our political system and democracy, and how this may or may not violate U.S. law. Gaps in our laws make us susceptible to many of the tactics we will discuss today. I'm pleased that President Ilves is here, that Ms. Conley and Dr. Buchanan and Mr. Weinstein are here. I want to particularly recognize the work that the Center for Strategic and International Studies has done. The Kremlin Playbook, of which Ms. Conley was the principal author, is a very significant and telling document. And let me welcome Ken Weinstein back to this committee. We have worked together on many issues. He was an adversary on some, I will say, but a principled and honorable adversary, and I'm delighted to have him back.
Thank you. We do have a great panel here. His Excellency Tamas Ilves is the former president of Estonia from 2006 to 16. He now works for advisor for the Center for International Studies and Cooperation. I can't say the name. Bernard and Susan, how do you say it? Okay. Let's see. Center for International Security and Cooperation. And he's also at the Institute for International Studies. And as I said, the former president of Estonia. And he'll tell you what it's like to live in Estonia when the Russians are next door. Heather Conley is the Europe Program Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she wrote the book, The Kremlin Playbook, and we're in it. Dr. Ben Buchanan is a postdoctoral fellow, Cybersecurity Project, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. And Mr. Weinstein has been introduced. He was the former advisor to George W. Bush, Homeland Security Advisor, and former Assistant Attorney General for National Security in the Bush administration. Welcome all. We'll start with you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Honorable Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. In my prepared remarks submitted to you, I review the development of the tools of disrupting democracies as they have been used. First in my part of the world, Eastern Europe, and later in Western Europe, and ultimately elsewhere. To sum up my written testimony, we are under attack. It is an attack against Western democracies and on the institutions that bind them, the EU and NATO. This attack is at once asymmetrical, yet ideologically promiscuous. By the latter, I mean that an authoritarian regime supports both extreme left and extreme right parties that are both, or on both sides, anti-EU, anti-NATO, and anti-US, and it does what it can to undermine centrist parties and centrist politicians. It is asymmetrical because our democratic institutions, free and fair elections, rule of law, respect for fundamental rights and freedoms, especially freedom of the press, do not allow us to respond in kind. These tactics, disruption of the internet, hacking into parliaments, political parties and candidates, and more importantly, doxing or publishing hacked private correspondence, and ultimately spreading false stories or fake news, represent a new form of aggression. And I say it is aggression. Von Clausewitz said almost 200 years ago, war is the continuation of policy by other means. So why engage in military conflict if you can change democratic governments in order to follow policies you favor, such as, for example, lifting of sanctions for its occupation and annexation of Crimea? If the unity of the European Union to maintain sanctions or to stand up to corruption stymies your foreign policy, if NATO is willing to stand up for the security of its easternmost allies, why not foment anti-EU and anti-NATO and an anti-American sentiment by supporting fringe parties that share that view? We should be concerned. This year, we shall see elections of 3 of the 4 remaining large EU countries, France and Germany, and as most observers predict, a snap election in Italy. The Netherlands, a crucial partner in NATO and the EU, holds elections today as we speak. I should add that the Dutch are so fear disruption that they have gone back to paper ballots, eschewing even voting machines. Disinformation, hacking, fake stories have all been used in these countries to support far-right and far-left anti-NATO, anti-EU, and anti-US parties and candidates, and against centrist transatlanticists, most notably Mrs. Merkel. Only in the past several weeks, we have seen the Foreign Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, also come under a fake attack. The age of the internet has allowed these practices to flourish, especially disinformation. Statistics in Europe are not yet out, but BuzzFeed here in the U.S. reported that in the last 3 months leading up to the U.S. election, fake news stories were shared on Facebook 8.7 million times, surpassing shared mainstream news by 1.4 million shares. Meanwhile, the Pew Center reported last summer that 62% of Americans get their news from social media. There's no reason to think that the statistics in other advanced democratic countries that are facing elections should differ from what we have seen in the U.S. And secondly, in conclusion, the other dilemma we face is that these threats from authoritarian regimes are asymmetric. That is to say, we can't do to them what they do to us. Authoritarian regimes control the press. They're not afraid of hacks or doxing that would show the corruption of their rulers. People never see that news. Fake news, as deplorable as they may be, have no traction there when the press is controlled. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter anyway if you count the votes in the end. Fake news, interference, and electoral processes we've observed already a long time ago in Eastern Europe are new to our NATO allies in the West. We used to have to jump hoops to prove fake stories about us were in fact fake. But now, I don't want to use the German word Schadenfreude, but now, in some senses, we feel redeemed, seeing that now more Western countries are facing what we have faced for a quarter centuries. And I'll conclude, if you give me 20 seconds, with a quote from Jonathan Ayall, the director of the Ministry of Defense think tank, RUSI, in London. Quote, "We spent 20 years telling the Eastern Europeans they were paranoid, living in the past, that they should treat Russia as a normal country. Now it turns out they were right. To prevent this from becoming an existential rift, to keep former communist countries still believing in the alliance, NATO is going to need to do a lot of clever footwork, unquote. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm impressed with how well I understand Estonian. That was excellent. Ms. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. It is absolutely vital that we understand Russia's strategy of influence, how it works in our democracies, and to develop an effective strategy to combat it. It's so important that we recognize not only the tools that Russia uses, but we have to educate Americans on how to recognize these tools and to defeat their influence. Russia's strategy of influence is contained in Russia's doctrine, New Generation Warfare, of which its primary goal is to break the internal coherence of the enemy system. Russian influence works through a variety of economic and political channels, and it adapts to specific national situations, including biased news outlets, intelligence networks, Russian-financed non-governmental organizations, business linkages, and friendly politicians. While all of these tactical elements need to be understood in their own right, we can't lose sight of their cumulative effect and their overarching strategic objective, and that is the weakening of U.S. global leadership and its dominance of the international system. It's the weakening and ultimate collapse of NATO and the European Union. And finally, it is about the breakdown of the internal coherence, credibility, and moral authority of Western democracies. And once this coherence and cohesion is broken, a post-Western world can in fact be achieved. So let's be clear that Russia does not engineer the entire framework in which it conducts its strategy. It takes advantage of pre-existing institutional, political, and governance weaknesses and exploits them. So in fact, we must look to ourselves and our rules and our laws to help defeat Russian influence. So CSIS, in cooperation with our Bulgarian partner, the Center for the Study of Democracy, focused on how Russian economic influence impacts 5 European countries. I asked that a copy of the report be submitted for the record. We describe Russian tactics as an unvirtuous circle of influence. It takes hold of democratic societies through 2 channels, political and economic influence. The political influence can come through anti-European and fringe parties. It can go through individuals, possibly businessmen who've turned politicians, non-governmental organizations. It can spread through information wars and even the Russian Orthodox Church. The economic channel is more powerful in some respects. It works through a network of Kremlin insiders, former intelligence officers, and local oligarchs to manipulate and dominate strategic sectors of a country's economy. And our report looked at how both of these channels, both the political and the economic, work together. And what we found is that corruption is the key and principal conduit for the impact of Russian influence. And the reason that they go after those strategic sectors like energy, like finance, is that's where there are the biggest opportunities to exploit and use corruption. But what has allowed Russia's strategy to be so successful is Western susceptibility and in some ways complicitness with Russia's exploitation. And we found this over and over where we're not influencing and impacting our own transparency laws, our beneficial ownership, abuse of funding for political party financing and non-governmental organizations. It's in fact in our power to stop these Russian tactics. So in our report, we recommend that our first line of defense is strengthening Western democratic institutions and societies. We believe that the Treasury Department will play a critical role in how we combat Russian economic influence by tracking and tracing illicit Russian-linked financial flows. We encourage strongly a very robust cooperation with the European Union in fighting these corrupt practices, strengthening the independent judiciary and independent media and governance practices of our NATO allies. Building and strengthening financial transparency requirements and beneficial ownership will go an extraordinary way to prevent these corrupt practices to further Russian influence. Finally, I'd like to say in our U.S. embassies, we need to start thinking of our legal attachés as perhaps playing as critical a role in defending the United States as our defense attachés. Our national security and the security of America's most important allies rests on our ability to resist Russia's strategy of influence, and thus far, we have failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. The primary focus of my academic research at Harvard and at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is examining how nations use their capabilities for attack and espionage in cyberspace and the strategies that drive that usage. It goes without saying that Russia is a key player in this regard. So I'd like to make 3 points here to begin the discussion. First, we often think of Russian hacking as something that is new and different, but to do so is to be ignorant of history. There's a demonstrated pattern of Russian cyber operations stretching back several decades at this point. One major early case, sometimes referred to as Moonlight Maze, involved a series of penetrations for espionage purposes into American political, military, and economic institutions. That operation and the operations since then have shown adeptness in several ways. Perhaps most significant is that they demonstrate how the Russians have developed new digital methods to accomplish old tasks. The series of espionage cases show the Russian aptitude for gathering information using computer hacking. The 2007 attack on Estonia and the 2008 attack on Georgia are an exhibit of how Russia uses cyber operations against democratic states. Though we know somewhat less about it, the 2015 blackout in Ukraine, the first ever publicly known case of a power outage caused by a cyber attack, shows the potency of cyber attacks that appear to be Russian in origin. And the 2016 election interference demonstrates that the Russians have married their long-standing history of influence operations with their more recently developed capacity for hacking. The threat these activities pose to democracies and to their fundamental institutions deserves great scrutiny and often resistance. Second, there is a damaging perception that it is impossible to understand who is responsible for which activities in cyberspace. This is sometimes called the attribution problem, and it is not nearly the roadblock that it is sometimes made out to be. Alongside Professor Thomas Ridd of King's College London, I spent a year investigating how it is possible to do attribution in cyberspace. After technical study and interviews with computer forensic experts in the private sector and in multiple intelligence agencies, we concluded that not only is accurate attribution possible, but that advanced nations such as the United States do it regularly. It is possible to do some form of attribution by relying on forensics data, such as language indicators, infrastructure indicators, time zone exploit indicators, among many others. For intelligence agencies, human and singles intelligence sources can provide additional vital information on the intentions of another state and can confirm attribution hypotheses. Rarely is any single piece of evidence by itself conclusive when it comes to doing attribution in cyberspace. Hackers do sometimes leave false flags to try to mislead investigators. Nonetheless, the United States intelligence community and private sector firms have overcome the attribution problem in many instances in recent years and have developed a strong understanding of how various nations, including Russia, operate in cyberspace. As early as the middle of last summer, the technical evidence strongly indicated that the Russians were responsible for the hacking activities against the Democratic National Committee and the related entities. The United States intelligence community report gives me still greater confidence in this assessment. In short, when it comes to many major Russian cyber activities, attribution is simply not an issue. Third, I'd like to close by taking a broader view. Every cyber activity takes place in a strategic context, and we would do well to remember that context when we analyze them and consider responses. Old strategic ideas, such as deterrence, do not go away when it comes to this new mode of engagement between nations, though they are often at first difficult to translate. Many of the Russian activities occur, I believe, because Russia has developed the capability to act, senses an opportunity to do so, and calculates that the benefits of the operation will exceed the costs. In short, we have not yet been able to devise means of deterrence in cyberspace that extend to the kinds of activities we are discussing here today. Establishing deterrence with our own cyber capabilities has proven challenging, in part because we have not always communicated our resolve well, and in part because we are rightly worried about further escalation. These difficulties are important and deserve strategic attention. We must find ways to better defend our vital computer systems, denying adversaries the opportunity to act. We must develop methods of deterrence that impose costs for significant malicious actions, and we must communicate those clearly. I am mindful of the lesson from history, sometimes called the security dilemma, that nations often unintentionally threaten one another as they preserve their interests. I've written a great deal about how the security dilemma can apply to cyberspace. And so I believe we must develop a strategy that protects our interests but does not unduly threaten other nations. Calibrating a response in this fashion is not an easy task, but it is a vital one. After what has happened this past year, few issues are more important than this right now. Thank you very much.
Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Whitehouse, it's a real pleasure to see you again. Members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. You're doing a real service by having this hearing today and highlighting what has really sort of gotten lost in much of the political controversy since last fall's election, which is that today we are facing an unprecedented and growing threat to democratic institutions around the globe. As my fellow panelists have eloquently testified, this threat is real and has already manifested itself in a number of different countries around the world, including in the nations of Central and Eastern Europe, in Estonia, in the nation of Georgia, and here in the United States, where the intelligence community assesses that elements of the Russian government-directed an influence campaign against our political system in 2016 that involved the cyber intrusions into state and local election board systems, the penetration of the DNC and the release of material to influence the campaign, the use of internet trolls to spread disinformation, and the launching of a general propaganda campaign to spread their preferred narrative around the world. Given the perceived success of these tactics in roiling our election, we should all expect to see more of them in future elections, not only from Russia, but also from other hostile countries like Iran and North Korea. So the threat is real and it's growing. The next question is, how can we respond to the threat? And the government has a number of tools at its disposal. First, it has all the national security investigative tools like FISA court electronic surveillance orders and national security letters, as well as the criminal tools that it can use to detect these influence activities. Second, it has the ability to bring a criminal prosecution against the perpetrators under, for instance, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for hacking into protected computer systems, or under the Foreign Agent Registration Act for those who engage in domestic political activities on behalf of a foreign party without registering as foreign agents. Criminal prosecution can have a meaningful deterrent effect, as we saw in 2015 when the Chinese finally agreed to an international protocol against cyber theft, but only after we had charged 5 members of the Chinese military with stealing American trade secrets. Deterrence can also be effectively achieved through the application of economic and trade sanctions, such as when President Obama imposed sanctions last December on Russia's 2 leading intelligence services and 4 Russian intelligence officials. And deterrence can be achieved through the ejection of a country's official staff from the United States, such as when the President ejected 35 suspected Russian intelligence operatives and closed 2 official Russian facilities at the same time that he imposed sanctions last December. Another option is the enforcement of campaign finance laws to prevent foreign nationals and foreign interests from contributing to U.S. political campaigns. With the recent reports of Russian funding for a French far-right party presidential candidate, allegedly in part as a reward for her supporting Russia's actions in Crimea, there is heightened concern that Russia may make similar attempts to sway American politics with campaign funding and contributions. And a final area of focus is on the protection of the electoral systems themselves, which was the purpose behind DHS's announcement in January this year that election processes will henceforth be designated as critical infrastructure, like the energy grid or the telecommunications industry, and other critical sectors that receive federal assistance and protection. So those are a number of the tools and capabilities being used to meet the threat. In light of recent events, however, we need to think of ways to strengthen those tools, and I'd like to flag 3 such ways. The first is to give the Justice Department statutory authority to get a legal enforcement injunction against operators of botnets that take over networks of computers and launch disruptive attacks, as we saw Russia do in Estonia in 2007.
As the authors of that bill, the chairman and I heartily agree.
I thought you would, sir. The second is to enhance the effectiveness of the Foreign Agent Registration Act by giving Justice Department attorneys the authority to compel suspected foreign agents to turn over records that show whether they are or are not, in fact, working on behalf of foreign interests. And the third is simply a recommendation that the government seriously consider the deterrence that is available under the international law concept of countermeasures, which are unlawful actions that a victim nation can lawfully take in order to persuade another country to stop victimizing it, like an example being a victim nation hacking back to persuade another country to stop hacking them. While this approach raises a host of difficult questions, I agree with the many commentators who encourage the government to consider such countermeasures as a means of deterring future foreign interference in our elections. So to conclude, we do have a number of effective tools and capabilities to meet this threat. The real question for today, however, is whether we also have the single-minded focus and the will to do so. All too often, we as a country have been slow to mobilize in the face of a looming threat, such as we were with al-Qaeda in the 1990s and with the cyber threat in the 2000s. It's my hope that we will not be slow in responding to this threat. This hearing is an important step in the right direction, but it's critical that we follow up with a resolute and decisive action. The threat is real, and it is not an overstatement to say that there is a lot at stake, no less than the continuing viability of democratic processes around the world. I want to thank the subcommittee again for holding this hearing and for giving me the opportunity to speak about this important topic, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. I note the arrival of our chairman. Senator Grassley, would you like to say anything? Would you like to go first?
One question I'd like to ask, and I want a real short statement in the record.
Without objection. Since you fund us, we're going to let you do that.
Okay. I have a question of Dr. Buchanan. In your testimony, you asserted that accurate attribution for a cyber operation is possible. In other words, it's possible to figure out who was behind an attack. Is that true even if a sophisticated country is the attacker as opposed to a terror group or a criminal organization as other opportunities? I ask this because I would guess that countries like Russia, China, even our own country, have very complex ways of trying to cover their tracks in the cyber world. So help me understand how it's possible to accurately attribute an attack to one of those types of countries.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, my belief is that it is possible for a nation such as the United States to attribute the activities of even another sophisticated actor. This relies on a combination of technical means. For example, one of the strong indications that the Russians were behind the breach of the DNC this past summer was the reuse, it appears, of an IP address, so essentially an address relating to a computer between that intrusion and a previous intrusion into the German parliament in 2015. So nations have the capacity to look at these technical indicators, and private sector firms over the past year have done, in my view, a very good job of bringing those indicators out into public view. It also bears noting that nations such as the United States have the capacity to collect intelligence of our own using sources and methods of the intelligence community, which can be enormously useful in doing attribution and in confirming the intentions or the ultimate responsibility of who ordered a particular cyber activity. And that is a set of tools not available to the private sector, but that enables nations to do even better attribution, though often attribution behind closed doors.
I thank you for that opportunity, and Senator Whitehouse and Senator Graham for your leadership in this. I appreciate it very much. Very important that you do this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the support. Thank you for the Mr. Chairman, for the support you and Senator Feinstein have given the subcommittee. We really appreciate it. Mr. President, President Ilvius, when you were first in office, you took down a statute of who?
It was, no, not a statue of Putin, but rather a Soviet statue in the center of town that was causing lots of disruption.
So you removed a Soviet-era statue in the center of town, and what happened?
Well, we moved it actually to a military cemetery, which is more appropriate for a statue of a soldier. Well, I mean, all kinds of things happened. There were street protests, but then what we discovered one day was that none of our governments, our major government sites, our online media, and our banks were not working. It was initially surprising because no one could understand, but then we realized we were under a DDoS, or distributed denial of service attack, which is usually done or generally done by botnets, which are networks of hacked computers. Most of the time, these are run by criminal organizations, and most of the time they send you Viagra spam. That is, they send out in all directions, but then you can redirect them to focus on single servers, which overloads them, and then they basically shut down. And that was where I said that given that there were criminal gangs doing this, then and the time was bought that this was a unique form of public-private partnership, of which we have seen numerous examples since then, and most recently, I would say today, with the announcement of the Attorney General about people involved in hacking for money and for stealing money who are at the same time employees of the FSB.
Is it fair to say that during your time as president of Estonia, you were under constant attack in different forms by Russia?
Well, it came in waves, and I would say that in many ways it's decreased in the last several years as efforts directed towards first Ukraine and then now, as we see, in attacks on French sort of mainstream politicians, attacks on Germany, most notably the Lisa case of last year, where there was a fake news story.
Right.
That we're kind of we're they're not
moving on. Yeah. What do you think the consequence would be, and very briefly, if you could, if the United States decided to forgive and forget what Russia did in our election? What kind of consequence would that be for the world at large, and what kind of signal would that send to Putin?
Well, I believe, sir, it would encourage them to continue, because it is precisely the goal of these attacks, not only here, but right now, ongoing elections and election campaigns in Europe, to put in place governments that would be friendly to Russian behavior in Ukraine, would stop sanctions and so forth.
Thank you. Ms. Conley, do sanctions work, you believe, when it comes to deterring Russia?
They do have limited...
Microphone.
They do have limited applicability. I think for the U.S. and European sanctions, the penalties on Russian long-term access to financial capital beyond 30 days has been important to it. But there has to be a full spectrum of deterrence measures, ranging from the military deterrence, and the fact that there's a NATO battalion deploying to Estonia is as important as sending strong messages about anti-corruption, signaling that we will fight the lack of transparency wherever it may be.
Do you think it'd be appropriate for Congress to impose new sanctions on Russia for what they have done in our election? Would that be the right signal to send from your point of view?
What I would recommend is that there is a full review of the entire spectrum of U.S. Policy responses to Russia, meaning we tend to silo our policy responses. We have to look at holistically. We have to look at what the long-term objectives will be for that. Sanctions are a powerful tool. They're an important tool. But if you do them just for every issue, whether that's Ukraine, the elections, I think you're missing looking at a comprehensive approach.
Mr. Buchanan, the problems we see with Russia, do other countries have similar capabilities to interfere with us?
I think it's fair to say that Russian capabilities are particularly advanced, but it's also worth noting there are countries such as China that have a long history of developing and using cyber capabilities, not necessarily against elections per se, but against a range of American targets.
If we forgave Russia for their interference in our election, I don't believe it changed the outcome, but it definitely interfered. Do you think that would be inviting China and Iran maybe to come in later?
Certainly, I think that a forgive and forget strategy here would risk emboldening a range of countries, including but not limited to Russia. That would include China as well.
Mr. Weinstein, you go back to the Bush era. You've been dealing with this problem. The trajectory is pretty unnerving. What have you seen when it comes to all things Russia and democracy from the time you're in the Bush administration to now? And would you agree with the concept that whatever we've been doing in the past really hasn't worked enough?
I would definitely agree with that statement that we haven't done enough, but I would say that you sort of have to look at the historical progression. The Russians have been consistent. The Russians, back to the Soviets, have been consistent with their approach. And in a geopolitical sense, what's bad for the U.S. is good for Russia in their eyes. And so I think what we've seen change over the years is there is now the technological means to intrude and interfere in internal elections processes in ways that they couldn't before because of the development of the internet. So you now have an ability to do what maybe they didn't have the ability to do back in the Cold War. You also have an area of opportunity now. They see possible daylight between us and some of our partners, so I think they're methodically looking at that daylight and trying to expand it so they can bring countries back into their sphere of influence and divide our allies.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Conley, your testimony focuses really effectively and kind of captures the Kremlin Handbook report with respect to Russia's efforts to infiltrate, corrupt, degrade, and discredit democracies. And with the last election, we know we've been added to that list. You described that there are two key channels for that operation. One is a political influence channel, which might include things like fake news or trolling or doxing or even using corruption to support those, as you point out. And the second is economic influence, bribery, corruption, money laundering, various wheeler-dealering that either buys or puts people in threat of being divulged as having been bought, people of consequence. In your view, if a country has experienced one of those two techniques, how alert should it be to look for the second technique?
What we found on the economic footprint, if in the 5 case study countries that we analyzed, if Russia's economic presence was greater than 12% of a country's gross domestic product, it was more likely that economic means were the primary channel of influence. Now, there were variations to that. If, in fact, there was a lower economic presence, that would mean the political channel would be the most viable. And again, these countries still had the networks, both the business, the intelligence, and security networks that were used to affect. And in certain countries, we cite Bulgaria as an example where both channels were used to such an effect where one was supporting the other that it led to state capture.
I guess my question is, if you're a country that has experienced this Russian effort through one channel, should you be looking for the same effort on the other channel? Is one an indicator to look out because they may be coming at you on both channels?
One channel supports the involvement of the other until they basically come together and become all-encompassing.
So it would be prudent for a country that has sustained an attack on one channel to be highly alert and look for signs of how the other channel might have been deployed also.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, and in terms of investigating the economic channel, are financial and tax records important to putting together the cases that can uproot the systems of economic influence?
Transparency is absolutely critical to breaking the strategy of influence and understanding where those sources of funding come from. They are designed to be hidden. They are designed to be opaque. For instance, if you look at Bulgaria, the country that is the most significant provider of foreign direct investment.
Let me jump in away from, I love Bulgaria, but let's look at the United States for a minute. You've talked about the pre-existing weaknesses that the Russian effort exploits. Would one of those pre-existing weaknesses include legal structures that are non-transparent, or to use your words, have lax ownership disclosure requirements?
It's extremely vital to understand beneficial ownership of companies that are participating in major procurements. That is certainly an important vehicle. It's very important to understand where the funding is going. And in terms of money laundering,
understanding beneficial ownership so you can penetrate shell corporations is also important, correct?
Yes, it is.
And are you familiar with what the EU has recently done with respect to beneficial ownership and shell corporations?
Yes, we do follow the EU
so
closely.
They've recently cleaned that up considerably, haven't they?
They are working on, in fact, it's both a G20 initiative to try to prevent tax havens, to help open that up. Investigative journalism has also done an extraordinary amount. The Panama Papers were very illuminating, in particular to our report.
And your recommendation is that we strengthen financial transparency requirements.
Absolutely. It has to be an international effort.
President Ilves, you have the same thing. Part of what you recommend is that it's very important to investigate money laundering. If you're going to investigate money laundering, you have to have access to financial records, correct?
Absolutely.
And it would help to have access to tax records to understand the financial picture of individuals who might be involved in the matter.
True.
And shell corporations whose true ownership is indeterminable, how do they function? Are they a hazard, or do you need to be able to look at beneficial ownership, true ownership of corporations in order to understand the economic manipulations?
Absolutely, because you don't know why something is happening unless you know who is the owner. And we've seen these cases across Europe, and not only in, say, the energy field, but also in real estate, but also even in the media, where we're not sure who owns a newspaper, for example.
And Mr. Weinstein, in your work at the Department of Justice and elsewhere, you understand that economic influence and corruption is a Russian tactic here. You say in your testimony, I understand, that it's important, to use your words, to acquire relevant records, such as financial records, in order to effectively understand the danger of the tactic of corruption. Is that correct?
Absolutely, sir.
And that it's also important to be able to produce business records, to be able to look through and see what's going on?
Absolutely, yes.
And would tax records be a form of financial and business records that are useful to investigators as they try to determine the scope of the economic influence operation?
Sure. As you know, tax records are a very sensitive topic, and there are special rules about the handling and availability of tax records for prosecutors.
But from an investigative point of view, they're pretty vital.
From an investigative point of view, they're obviously helpful.
And shell corporations whose true ownership can't be determined, is that a good thing to have in this world?
Well, there are a lot of values at play, but obviously from the investigative perspective, the more you know about the entities out there that might be doing some wrongdoing, the more you know, the better, no question.
And it is, from your prosecutorial experience, that very often somebody with a malign purpose will run their operation through not just one shell corporation, but a shell corporation behind a shell corporation behind a shell corporation to hide their hand.
Absolutely. Many of them are multi-layered, and it takes a lot of work to get to the bottom of them, and often you're just not able to. And
often you're just not able.
The perpetrator succeeds in asking what he's doing.
And if the perpetrator is a foreign nation trying to hack our democracy, that's pretty darn serious.
That's serious.
Thank you.
Senator Sass.
Mr. President, can you help us understand your view of Putin's timeline with regard to an end game in NATO? And to what degree do you think the Europeans understand what his objectives are with regard to NATO?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Well, I think it's hard to say what the timeline is, but the goal is clear that as long as the EU and equally and more importantly NATO is united and maintains its current membership, then policies of an entity that is much larger, much richer, much more powerful than Russia leaves Russia in at a disadvantage. If you break up NATO, then every country except for the United States is going to be smaller than Russia. If you break up the EU, then the largest country in the EU at 80+ million people is Germany, and compared to Russia, again, it's small. And then when you think of NATO with countries like mine, then we're quite minuscule and would be at a distinct disadvantage. Now, that's the goal, I would argue, and has been the goal for a while, because if you read even Yeltsin-era op-ed pieces or opinion pieces, Russia does not wish to deal with a European Union, but bilaterally, and so too, of course, NATO has been a bête noire ever since 1949. So again, it's hard to say what the timeline is, but certainly with the amount of pressure we see today put to crucial elections this year in Europe, where support is going every time to anti-NATO, anti-EU, and anti-US fringe parties, basically, and with success, that this is part of the plan. And were you to, for example, get France to step out of NATO and the European Union, that would be a death blow or near death blow to both organizations.
Do you think there's been an acceleration in his ambitions from first trying to cause panic and understandable paranoia among smaller near neighbors to striking deeper into Europe, where it seems like public understanding of the historic significance of NATO is on the wane?
I think he was surprised by the success that they met with the Ukrainian crisis, in which they actually managed to penetrate serious so-called objective news sources, where you saw the BBC repeating propaganda lines on Ukraine to so-called balance the reporting from Ukraine. So repeating stories about that were purely fake as sort of as the kind of balancing side. And I think that encouraged them, saying it works. It really does work.
Thank you. Ms. Conley, I want to ask you some questions, but I'd just like to acknowledge the chairman reset my 5-minute clock, so I'd like to say thank you, and I'm going to use all of my extra time. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely. Only for you.
Ms. Conley, can you tell us a little bit about Putin's internal political constraints with regard to the illicit economy? Are there shades of gray inside the illicit economy of some of his cronies who are worried about the adventurism and think that in industry X, Y, or Z, this is more dangerous than people who just like his distraction tactics to prop himself back up at home with the adventurism?
Thank you, Senator. Well, the Russian economy and President Putin's management of it has stabilized the economy for now. The long-term trajectory is quite dire. It appears that the Siloviki, this sort of the inner circle of their business interests, have remained fairly stable. There is certainly changes, cannibalization, if you will, of different companies nationalized to maintain benefits, but the economy is under great strain. What we found in our report, interestingly, in all of these Russian influence operations, there was a connection to President Putin's inner circle. So certainly enriching and continuing to enrich that small inner circle is very important. But I think there's a myth in some ways that the sanctions have had a devastating impact on the Russian economy. They have hurt them, but they have stabilized. He is working very hard. President Putin understands he's now having to harden. That's why he has created his own National Guard. He knows things are going to get very rough, but he is stabilizing the economic situation. He's ready for the long term and making sure that inner circle, which there have been changes, there's generational changes going on right now. He's passing leadership from his peers to another generation. He's sculpting them. So I think we have to understand their further enrichment is very important, but we're seeing impact of lack of payment to pensions and teachers. The social welfare system is crumbling, but the inner circle is being maintained.
How rich is Putin?
I have no idea, sir.
Any of you have any estimates, Mr. President? You're not usually bashful.
Well, the reports say 100 billion, but who knows? But certainly it's a lot.
And just to be clear, for the record, this is a guy who's a public sector bureaucrat for most of his life, and we think he might be worth on the order of $100 billion. There's no moment of significant private sector activity where he had a stake in a private equity company or something.
But this is a pattern repeated across the board among senior leaders in public service in Russia. I mean, we have press secretaries with $30,000 Swiss watches.
Mr. Weinstein, were you trying to jump in there? You know some of the history on the guy?
No, I'm a little perplexed how a public servant gets $100 billion in his bank. Wish I could do that.
I don't see that spreading through the Congress.
And I know I'm at time, so just one parting question. How likely do you think it is that congressional IT systems have been infiltrated by Russian security services?
Unless you use two-factor authentication almost certain.
Dr. Buchanan?
I think that I'd be very concerned. If you put me in charge of Congressional IT tomorrow, I would not spend my first action looking outward. I would look inward, but that is true of any high-priority network at this point. Find the intruders who are already inside.
Thank you all for your work.
Senator Durbin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this hearing. I said it the other day when we had our meeting with the Foreign Ops Subcommittee. It is refreshing to have this kind of bipartisan conversation, and I hope we have many more of them. Thank you for your leadership. President Elvis, when you were attacked in 2007 by the Russians, you basically said at the time this was an attack on NATO because Estonia was new to NATO. Do you think that other NATO countries felt that it was an attack on them as well?
Thank you. I can say that at the time, this did not really get much traction. At the time, of course, people had not fully understood the nature of cyber attacks and their debilitating consequences. I mean, just to keep things in perspective, 2011, 4 years later, was the first time that the Munich Security Conference actually had a panel on cyber. I mean,
2011.
2011. Yet in 2016, NATO declared it a fourth domain of warfare. So we've seen considerable progress, and say one of the few Russian-owned goals was that we had been lobbying for some time, given the nature of our country, for a NATO center on cybersecurity, toward which much of NATO is very skeptical, but after our cyber attacks, a number of countries sort of came on board, and it has now been in operation for some 8 years. But initially, I don't think countries understood the full impact or the power of digital weaponry.
The interesting thing in Ukraine is that the Russian military attack, together with the hybrid war, the propaganda attack, the cyber war, has really moved Ukraine closer to Europe, closer to the West. The polls are showing it. The people of Ukraine feel that is where their future is as more and more aggression comes out of Russia. When I was in Poland 4 weeks ago, one of the leaders there said something I'd like you to comment on. He said, "We're watching you in the United States." He said, "We want to see how you react to the invasion of Vladimir Putin in your presidential election, because it's a signal to us of how you would react if our country was invaded by Putin."
I couldn't disagree. I mean, I would say that's, I think, how lots of people, lots of countries that have felt under threat sort of subliminally feel. They may not always say it, but certainly I think that's a common feeling.
You made another point which I'd like to ask the other panelists to refer to, and that is the asymmetrical aspect of this. The president of Lithuania, Grybauskaitė, closed down RT and Sputnik for a period of months because of the outrageous fake news they were peddling into her country. So it's a challenge to those who are dedicated to freedom of expression, speech and press, as to whether there would be some government action to stop what Putin is trying to achieve through the most obvious source, through RT. I'd like to know what the panelists think about that.
If I may, just yesterday, the German government submitted a bill that would lead up to fines of 50 million euros or $53 million for social media spreading fake news. I mean, this is going to be a tough one, between the Scylla and Charybdis of security and our fundamental values of freedom of the press, and how we navigate this is going to be a tough one in a lot of countries.
I'd like the other panelists, if they'd like to respond to that.
Just very briefly, in some ways, Russian tactics are designed to be what we call below threshold. They are designed not to cause NATO to respond in a fulsome way. It's designed to isolate a country, make them feel that they are alone, that this is something that they have to deal with bilaterally with Russia. And so the more that we can enhance our own understanding and awareness of what's going on within Europe, within the NATO countries, that helps us understand these tactics. And I find our own knowledge about Europe and European political dynamics and our own strength of purpose with our allies. Congressional visits like yours are so important. We have to return to Europe much more fully as a foreign and security policy matter. On media, I will just briefly say, in some ways, it's a multi-vector issue. You have fake or false news, which are just blatantly wrong stories that are designed to put pressure on the government, create hysteria. There's the leaks of embarrassing information, which is designed to discredit government officials and institutions. The more you discredit leaders and institutions, the more false news is so powerful because you don't know what to believe. And third, something that President Ilves touched on, ownership of the media. The Baltic media market, I would argue the Central European media market, is increasingly becoming Russian-owned, which makes it more sympathetic to Russia's worldview and interest. And so we have to be very mindful. It gets back to beneficial ownership, who is owning these media companies and the messages that they're sending.
And I am noticing in some countries, I can name a couple, where Russian oligarchs are moving back into these countries and becoming major political players. I don't want to be conspiratorial here, but I think I will be. I wonder what's happening here with this kind of export of wealth and taking over of political operations in some of these countries. We're seeing more and more of that too. Others like to comment on the asymmetrical issue? Or
Senator, one point I would make that I think furthers what Ms. Conley said is the degree to which these influence operations are enabled by computer network exploitation, by hacking. And it was striking to me that the IC's report in December discussed both of them together. And one of the lessons I think that is immediate takeaway for everyone who's a media organization or a political figure is the importance of basic cybersecurity practices. So two-factor authentication on emails and so forth, because I do think it's often hacking operations that are used as the fuel for a broader influence campaign. So it's vital, I think, for everyone on this panel and beyond.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Senator Graham, Senator White House. I'll pick up where Senator Durbin left off, Mr. Buchanan, and that is with the cyber attacks. When Senator Graham and McCain and I were in Estonia, which was a beautiful country, thank you, and Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Georgia at the end of the year, I was just struck by these stories of all of the hacking. Ukraine targeted by Russian hackers more than 6,500 times over a 2-month period, and just today, 2 Russian spies and then some hackers indicted for hacking into Yahoo with millions of Americans as victims. So what do you see as the best deterrent? The President mentioned the Estonia-located NATO cyber center. What do you think is the best thing to do with these upcoming elections in Germany and France?
Thank you, Senator. In a Cold War context, we would often deter nuclear weapons with other nuclear weapons. It is sometimes difficult to deter a cyber capability with another cyber capability. Conceptually, it's useful to divide deterrence into 2 different kinds. One kind is what we call a cost imposition. So if a nation takes an activity we don't like, we will punish the nation. In order to be credible, the costs have to be credible. We have to communicate that. And I think beyond the very high-end activities, beyond power outages and so forth, we probably could do a better job of generating cost imposition options and communicating those to the Russians. The other kind, very briefly, is what we call deterrence by denial, so making it not worth the Russian time or another actor's time to break in and conduct these activities. And that's where improving our baseline cybersecurity defenses and those of our allies is vitally important.
Mm-hmm. All right. Mr. President, the fake news that's been discussed here at length, although I will say my favorite story was what Sheldon and I heard in Munich, and Senator Graham as well heard, was the story of the Norwegian Prime Minister that Russia has been running stories that their economy is in the tank in Norway and that they ran out of fruits and vegetables, and that Russians would come in to visit their friends and relatives with bags of fruits and vegetables because they believed these stories that were running that there were no fruits and no vegetables. vegetables in their country. And obviously that's an amusing example, but there are so many scary, serious ones. And one of the things I was struck by is education, is trying to, our public, it's, in my state, people believe when they see things are marked as news. They still believe them. And perhaps it is possible that the Estonia and some of these other countries have become more educated to this fake news, even though they are much more on the front line with the ownership of the media that Senator Durbin just brought up other problems. They have much more problems. But I thought that a lot of them could potentially see through this. Do you think that is also a tool in the toolbox that we're not using enough to really explain this to the public?
Thank you. Well, certainly education in general on social media is something that is vital. I mean, it's not just fake news. I mean, there are all kinds of bad things on social media, and for children, that's very useful. I would say our countries, especially the Baltic countries, kind of have taken a Ronald Reagan, there you go again approach to this, because we've become fundamentally inured. We don't believe it anymore, and what has changed is that before you guys believed it, but now you don't either anymore.
Thank you. Exactly. Ms. Conley, quickly, I read the whole playbook. It was really well done. And one of the things you talk about is the lack of transparency in campaign finance and how money can be funneled in. And of course, we have huge problems here with dark money and millions and hundreds of millions and $800 million, I think, spent outside money that's not tracked. Should we be concerned about this in terms of foreign money? If you could do it in about a minute and a half, I have one question for Mr. Weinstein. Thank you.
Of course. Again, transparency is absolutely vital, not only for political party financing, it's also increasingly becoming important for how funds are being spent for, we call them Potemkin organizations, these organizations that are appearing overnight advocating for a position that may be in Russia's interest, how different experts are funded. That transparency is vital as well. So absolutely, the more transparency, the better.
So that would be an argument for trying to improve our reporting and disclosure so we can try to figure out where this money is, because that is one of their modus operandis, right? To try to put money into elections in these other countries.
It is, and understand it is designed to be opaque and complex. So it would require
they're not
very
running with the Kremlin flag. Yeah, okay. No, I don't mean duh, like it was, I just meant like that's how they hide it. And they hide it in these other countries as well. Okay. Mr. Weinstein, one of the things that you talk about in your testimony is that how our country relies on state and local election processes, and that we must protect our own election infrastructure to guard against the types of threats like those we experienced last November. I am the ranking member on the Rules Committee as of this year, and one of the areas of our jurisdiction is elections and oversight with election equipment. Do our executive agencies need additional tools to effectively fight against Russian interference in our cyber networks, and what should we be doing to help our state and local governments get the best election-protected equipment that they can?
Thank you, Senator. That's a good question. And the question of protecting state and local electoral systems, that's a tough nut to crack, because those are constitutionally vested in the states, and each state and local jurisdictions run their own elections. And as we saw back in 2000, I guess it was, that became a big issue. And so there's no uniformity there, or at least no set uniformity. That doesn't mean there's not a place for the federal government. In fact, as I mentioned, the DHS recently designated the electoral infrastructure as part of the critical infrastructure. And the idea is to provide federal assistance and really provide information sharing among the different, the 50 different states and the different localities about the particular threats, maybe malware and the like. I mean, one of the saving graces is that the vote tallying systems are not typically online, so in terms of the ability to penetrate those systems and actually adjust the vote tallies, that seems like that's a lesser threat than what we did see last year, where they did get into the voter registration databases and the like, and there are conceivable ways that they can damage the voter databases and undermine the credibility of the elections. But I applaud any effort to try to get the state and local election officials together, thinking about these threats and make them aware of the specific threats that the intelligence community is seeing down the road, because we're going to see this again election after election.
Thank you very much.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Whitehouse. I'm grateful to both of you for convening this hearing, and I just want to express my thanks to the assembled witnesses for your compelling testimony today. Like several other members of the committee, I too have traveled. I led a bipartisan delegation to Eastern Europe in August. We had a chance to meet, I think, literally one of the last days of your service as president in Estonia, and also to visit with leaders in the Czech Republic and in Ukraine, and saw and heard firsthand many of the same things my colleagues have detailed about a long-term, persistent, engaged Russian campaign to undermine democracy in the more eastern NATO and EU countries, and then to divide us from each other and from Europe. And in August, Ranking Member Whitehouse and I, given some of the developments in late July, sent a letter to our colleague, Senator Cruz, who at the time was chair of the Oversight Subcommittee of Judiciary, expressing our grave concern about mounting reports of interference in our election by Russia. We asked for an oversight hearing to consider whether our existing federal statutes and court jurisdictions sufficiently addressed conduct related to foreign entities that pose a threat. And if I might, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to enter this into the record of the hearing. The Chairman Cruz declined to conduct a hearing, and I can't help but wonder if we might have gotten an earlier start on confronting this challenge. In my view, it's critical that our investigation into this, our consideration of this, and our confrontation of Russia's threats to our democratic institutions be clear-eyed, focused, and bipartisan. I want to thank Senator Graham for leading the Russia Review Act, which would make sure that Congress has a chance to weigh in before there's any decision or action by the President to relax sanctions against Russia. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor. And just 2 weeks ago, Senator Rubio, Republican Senator Rubio, joined me on the floor to speak in a bipartisan way about the threat of Russian aggression. There's a lot more we need to know about Russia's interference in our election, and it begins with this important inquiry in a bipartisan way into interference in other elections. So if I might first, President Ilves, in your prepared remarks, you note the asymmetrical advantages that a small number of highly motivated individuals can leverage against entire nation states. You also note the United States and our allies possess our own asymmetrical advantages. Can you discuss what you think are our strongest advantages in combating Russian infiltration and how we can most effectively utilize them?
Thank you. Well, looking at how much certain figures enjoy being in Miami or in London or Paris, certainly there is that is an asymmetrical advantage that the West has. Recall that Senator McCain was barred from entering Russia, causing huge mirth among people that he wouldn't be able to go vacation somewhere in Siberia. Right. That is clearly one thing we have that they don't. The other thing is parking money. Because if you do not have a rule of law country, then you can basically, you can always have your bank account sort of emptied. Without any due process. And so these two things, visiting the West and also parking your money here, I find it odd but typical that one of the leading proponents of the adoption ban for Russian children by Americans also has a huge multi-million-dollar condo complex in Miami. While he, on the one hand, decries the United States and the West, at the same time they enjoy the full benefits of it. I mean, as to decrying the West by Sergei Lavrov when his daughter goes to my university, Columbia, is also kind of odd. One thing I'd add here, I mean, let us not forget, it's not only cyber. There was a recent a coup attempt in the NATO invitee, Montenegro, where they were going to assassinate the prime minister. So the old stuff that we saw in Czechoslovakia in 1948 with defenestration of the prime minister, that's still there.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Weinstein, if I might, do you think our campaign finance laws are sufficient to prevent inappropriate financial influence by foreign actors? That's a line of inquiry Senator Klobuchar was on before. I just wanted to follow up with you. And I'd also like to ask you about jurisdiction over cyber. I think, a challenge for us in the Senate. Cyber challenges don't respect borders. They also don't respect committee jurisdiction. And we have literally half of the committees of the Senate arguably have some jurisdiction over cyber. Do you think we should be considering jurisdiction over cyber? There is a bill that would create a new specific committee to focus just on cyber and to pull all those strands together from many committees.
There are a few fights in life, Senator, that are really dangerous to get in the middle of, and one of them is a jurisdictional fight on the Hill.
That's one of them.
Discretion's the better part of valor on this one, sir. Look, but the principle is an important one, which is, and this is an enforcement matter within the executive branch as well. Where do the responsibilities for cyber lie? Do they lie with DHS, DOJ, DOD, and NSA? And it's very difficult because it spans over many areas. It's particularly difficult in terms of congressional jurisdiction, and I understand that because it affects, just as you can tell here, it affects so many aspects of our governance, right? Diplomacy, the economy, law enforcement, national security. So it's certainly something that I think requires some study, just like, for instance, the oversight of the Department of Homeland Security, same kind of overlapping issue that I know is a live issue right now. Your first question was about
whether our campaign finance laws are sufficiently robust to prevent inappropriate influence, something that many European countries have seen successful attempts by Russia to influence elections with dark money.
Right, and as you know, sir, there are serious First Amendment concerns that need to be addressed there. There are legal issues that need to be worked through. But once again, addressing this as an investigator, as Senator Whitehouse asked me to do, clearly, it's a concern that there are areas of campaign finance where there's some opaqueness. And as we've heard from the other panelists, the Russians are very sophisticated and adept at going right to where the opacity is, if that's the right word, and acting there. So I'm sure we see that in the campaign finance area too.
Ms. Conley, if I might, just a quick question. It appears, as you said, that Russia views cyber as a way to stay below the threshold of war and equalize its military and economic disparity to the West. How can we change our approach to alter Moscow's cost-benefit analysis and more nimbly respond to their ongoing provocative cyber attacks?
And this gets into the area of looking at those financial tools. I was interesting in the height of the Ukraine crisis, some conversation about perhaps preventing Russia's access to the SWIFT financial system, and their response was that would be similar to a nuclear attack. That's how strongly they view the importance of the access to the U.S. financial system, which is why I think, again, you're seeing many of the Russian funds that are safely ensconced in democracies to protect their funding in a rule of law situation. We have to begin assigning a cost. If they want to use the benefit of our society and our institutions, they must play by those rules, and we may have to prevent some of that access in order to have them to return to that rules-based approach. Things like that visa limitation is also another important area. There has to be some cost to this continued behavior.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think Senator Lee. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for coming in late and having to go back out, but Mr. Weinstein, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, sir.
How important is it for our country's leadership and our political parties to be united in pushing back against Russian interference in our elections and recognizing, dispel the misinformation propaganda? And I'm speaking of how important is it for both parties to do that?
Thank you, Senator. I think that's a very important question. I think that highlights the importance of this hearing. I don't think it's a political issue. It's not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's a national issue for us. And as we've heard earlier today, reasoning with the Russians, just like reasoning on cyber theft with the Chinese, isn't going to do it. Yeah. We got to have a resolute, strong, united push back against them, and that's the only way they're going to listen to us. And so I think it's really critically important that they see that we're united across the board.
Well, isn't it also important also to some other countries that know or at least seeing the implications of Russia doing exactly that in their countries?
Absolutely, and those countries will want to see our being unified and resolute about it.
Well, on that area, I might ask President Ilves. Did I pronounce that correctly, sir?
Ilves.
Ilves. Sorry. And Ms. Conley. Would you agree with me that it's extremely important that all of us, whether in public office or not, be very, very honest in speaking about what is happening in this regard, and that we have accurate reporting in the press about it? Mr. President, what about you?
Absolutely. Yet the problem is that not everyone quite understands the nature of these things, and so the reporting must not only be accurate, but it must also be informed. Because when it comes to something that's a little bit more technical, you get a lot of sheer nonsense written by people who don't understand the technical side of issues. So I think it's both reporting and quality.
Ms. Conley, do you agree?
Yes, Senator. In fact, your questions are very much linked. Bipartisanship is key because division is a weakness that Russia is exploiting in our societies. If we do not have transparency, we cannot understand what's going on. If we don't have honesty, we cannot rebuild trust in our leaders and our institutions. And in some ways, that is what's being exploited as well through false news, the leaks. That's what's critical. We have to rebuild that trust with our institutions and our leaderships. That can only happen through honesty, transparency, and a strong bipartisan sentiment.
Does everybody, both of you gentlemen, agree with that?
Absolutely, yes, sir, Senator.
Yes, Senator, I think there's value in unity, and there's value in particular in showing that unity in public. And I defer to the ranking member and the chairman on the best method to do that, but I was heartened by the comments earlier about the value of a public discussion of what happened in 2016.
Well, let me flip to the other side of that coin. If we allow the divisions to continue and we don't respond to it, is it overstated that this plays right into Russia's interests?
It continues to create a narrative for Russia that they are growing their success, which is increasing their boldness. And in fact, President Ilves' comment about what has occurred in Montenegro is perhaps the boldest thing we have seen, which means they are taking their views and their cues that they have much weakness to exploit. Success begins success, and until they are pushed back on this effort, they will continue to exploit that. So that's the difficulty of it.
Okay. You agree, Mr. President?
Absolutely. But here it's not only, since I can't really comment on American domestic politics.
Oh, go ahead. We all do.
Well, I would say that equally important is international unity among liberal democracies. That today, or up till now, we have had regionally based security. This is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because the countries are in the North Atlantic and everything is based on bomber range and tank logistics. Today, there are no distances, so it's actually they're liberal democracies that are under threat, be they Estonia, be they the United States, maybe next time Japan. Distance doesn't matter, which means that liberal democracies do really need to hang together, especially when we see, as Dr. Buchanan mentioned, I mean, APT-28, which attacked the DNC server, was also found in the German Bundestag, and it was also found in Estonia. I mean, not in a parliament. But the point is that the threats affect all of us.
So you don't think this was a one-time operation?
Oh, no.
Let me sort of close with this. NATO's been mentioned here. I think we'd all agree that NATO is important if there's unity, but there's also has to be within NATO an understanding that the United States stands strongly with it. Is that correct?
Yes.
And does this, if they see the United States being able to be manipulated by Russia, does that sow doubts in NATO?
Well, I don't think we believe that the United States is being manipulated by Russia.
But if we reach a point that we did?
I guess we'd be pretty nervous.
Okay. You all agree with that? Do you think that, do you think this operation of Russia was a one-time operation, or do you think we might see this in the future? Mr. Weinstein?
The operation regarding the 2016 election?
Yeah.
Absolutely, Senator Leahy. They're going to be emboldened by the extent to which they had an effect on the election, whether they affected the outcome of the election, they had an effect on the course of the election. It's caused a lot of disruption. They're going to be emboldened by that. They're going to come back even stronger next time. They're going to perfect their techniques, and other countries like North Korea, Iran, China are going to get on the bandwagon and do the same.
And I would just add that, as President Ilves mentioned, Europe's election calendar this year, beginning today with the Dutch elections, going to the French presidential election, German elections, we are going to see the continued incubation of this process, which we must have a very strong dialogue with Europe to understand both tactics and then strategies to combat them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the courtesy of stepping in.
Yes, sir, Senator Leahy. I just want to let you know that the French election, I believe, is in the April. Runoff would be in May. Is that correct?
First round, April 23rd. Second round, May 7th.
I think it's important that the Congress takes some kind of action on our bipartisan legislation to punish Russia for interfering in our election before the French elections. And Germany is in September. Is that
September 23rd.
Okay.
4th.
Finally, we'll go to Senator Franken. I view an attack on one party in the United States as an attack on all parties by a foreign entity. We need a kind of an Article 5 response here. Senator Franken.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate that response, Mr. Chairman. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you and the ranking member calling this hearing. I want to express my appreciation to Chairman Grassley as well, because what I'm hearing here is that our response to this as a Congress, as the United States, our response to this attack by the Russians is really important. That if we allow this to have happened and don't respond to it, it will invite just more and more of this. And this hearing is so important. And I would commend to every American to read the Kremlin playbook. And I know something about selling books, and I'll help you. I mean, what the Kremlin did here and how this works, how this has worked in Europe.
Sir, the book is free.
It's free, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, then I won't want to get involved. I'm a free market guy. This is really, can I have my time back, though? Okay. Get this book, Americans, because it tells you how this works. And it's absolutely important that people begin to, because you're talking about things being opaque, that this happens when their web of influence is so complex that it obscures activities. Am I right? That's exactly what you're saying. And this is about cultivating an opaque network of patronage. But you were talking, you talked about how important bipartisanship was and how important it is that it's important because we have to get at this. When you're attacking the credibility of the media and you're spreading fake news and you have trolls from Russia, and we have to understand, were there 1,000 trolls operating? And so they were changing the algorithms on Google so that if you'd Google something, you would get what they wanted, what the Russians wanted you to see. It would be the first article to come up. People need to read this and understand this. And what we need is transparency. And what we don't need is people accusing the media of spreading fake news. What we need is the American public to not get so thrown off that they just say, well, there is no such thing as the real news. And so they have a strategy of doing that in order to exploit that confusion. And so transparency is incredibly important. Now, in your book, you talk about them co-opting or compromising individuals in business, in financial dealings, right?
Yes.
Okay, and then corrupting them or being involved in, they may already be corrupt. They already may be a shady character. And corrupting someone who has political ambitions, say.
Yes, that is a method.
Okay. And is it important to have transparency in terms of people's financial dealings, in terms of like seeing their taxes, like the ranking member was talking about?
Senator, it's vital to have as much transparency as the law allows to understand what forces are influencing political parties, particularly influential political leaders.
And that's why it's important that there be transparency in our campaign finance laws, because right now we have this dark money that's in there where no one knows where it's coming from. And that is something that tells people this is all rigged. Everything's rigged. I don't believe anything. And I think it's one of the things that we need to have transparency in everything now in our politics. And this is something that I think is just absolutely pernicious. And because it undermines the trust that people have, and rightly so, in our political process. Mr. Buchanan, in your testimony, you note that the Russian interference in our 2016 election demonstrates that the Russians have married influence operations with their hacking capabilities. Could you talk more about how, in your view, the Russians have married these two strategies? I'm talking about leveraging diplomatic or economic or military capabilities. And how does this work?
Certainly, Senator. The Russians have a long history of influence operations and trying to shape the debate and the discussion and sometimes the government in foreign countries. This goes back well before computers were invented. What's significant about 2016 is that they have infused those old tactics with information stolen through cyber espionage, through hacking into computer systems, stealing data, and then using that data as part of an influence campaign. So this has enabled them to do more with their technique from an old tactic in the playbook by relying on digital methods to inform it.
Okay, thank you. I'm out of time. The book is The Kremlin Playbook, and it's available for free for every American. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, Senator Graham and Senator Whitehouse. And I want to join my colleagues in thanking really the bipartisan spirit of this hearing, which is to counter and deter what can only be regarded as an act of war. And I am not saying that for the first time. In fact, in the Armed Services Committee, we held a hearing on cyber attacks conducted against this country, calling a different set of witnesses, but reaching the same conclusion that we lack at present a coherent, cohesive strategy for deterring and countering these acts of war against our democratic institutions. And our nation needs to develop that kind of policy, just as we would if we were attacked militarily. And you make the point, Ms. Conley, that Russian doctrine is described as a new generation warfare. It's warfare. And we have to take it just as we would warfare, not just as a criminal enterprise. The indictment today of a couple of Russian agents, literally announced, I think, earlier today in connection with the Yahoo breach, included one of those agents who had been indicted previously. So I begin with 2 points. Number one, criminal prosecution alone is insufficient, even though there are criminal enterprises directed by Russia. And number two, the lack of a policy as to when we declare war contributes to the lack of deterrence. And let me ask you to comment on those 2 points. Ms. Conley?
Thank you, Senator. The challenge, as you exactly said, is understanding that this is a construct as part of warfare. And that's why I really highlight this is part of official Russian doctrine by the Russian General Staff. It's been put forward, and they've been very clear on that. It is a strategy to try to break our internal coherence. So we have to treat this as seriously as we would a declaration of war. I want to pick up an earlier point that Dr. Buchanan had made, and it gets back to the attribution and to your cyber question. In some ways, the attribution is easier, but the policy choices are so much harder, because this is a warfare where our system is being used against us. And so we have to strengthen our own societal responses. So part of that is educating. It is making people aware of when news is false and when it is true. It's creating the honesty and the integrity and rebuilding trust in those institutions. But the policy choices and the delays of policy choices as we try to understand these multifaceted responses, whether it's cyber, whether it's economic influence, that's what the challenge is. So the more we are clear and concise and very open about what our response will be if an act is taken, will go a long way to, I think, prevent this type of influence.
And you mentioned in your testimony the potential for complicity. You use that word. To what extent is that a danger or, in fact, a phenomenon in this country? It would seem that there is at least the need to investigate complicity.
In our report, we analyzed 5 European countries, but we found that neither Europe nor the United States is immune. So sometimes it is quite through very legal means of using a business through a legal transaction, but then it translates into some potentially kickbacks. It can so contort the economic domination of a particular sector that it has such influence that it then begins to change the nature of the act itself.
In this country as well as others?
We are not immune to these tactics. I think their prevalence is much greater in Europe economically because the linkages are so much stronger.
And you mentioned that the Russian doctrine of attack is, in a sense, and it is, I agree with you, a military doctrine, but it works through non-military actors, which make it more deniable but no less traceable. And, for example, the New York Times reported, I think earlier this week on, and I am going to mangle the name and pronunciation, but Borgachev, the hacker who, in a sense, is protected and rewarded by Russian authorities for committing mass theft. And so there's a $3 million reward available for him, but Russian protection evidently has defeated our efforts to apprehend and prosecute him.
We often find, again, in these very complex economic penetrations, there is a reward and an award system, meaning to protect the economic gains and to continue to award them as time goes on. So yes, there is certainly an element of wanting to protect sometimes very lucrative economic ties through either criminality or other means. And then there's a sense that if discovered, they can also help destroy or erode the credibility of the country of which they were working in, because they were able to work their tradecraft so well.
Well, Yevgeny Borgachev has gained access to 1 million computers through malicious software that allowed him to not only empty bank accounts and take credit card information from users, but to steal personal files such as business proposals and photographs. So the impact is not only on our democratic institutions, it's also on our financial and economic system, and multiply that effect, as in Yahoo, to the tune of $500 million, and taking what one military expert has described as the greatest theft of intellectual property in the history of the world, and also military leaders of our country, almost with unanimity, taking cyber as the greatest threat. I think this nation needs to be aware that we are under attack and we are engaged in a war, perhaps undeclared, but it is a war directed against our democracy and our economy on a scale that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago and still is unimaginable to most Americans. Would you agree? Thank you.
Thank you. We're coming to the end here, but I think Senator Whitehouse has a question.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to ask two fairly specific questions before we left. The first is for Mr. Buchanan. Could you just say a word about who Guccifer 2.0 is and how confident you think we can be about the attribution of him or her as a Russian hacker?
Thank you, Senator. After the DNC hack was revealed in the Washington Post last June and by a cybersecurity firm called CrowdStrike, a persona appeared online called Guccifer 2.0 within 24 hours. And this persona claimed that he himself had done the hacking and it had nothing to do with Russia. It seems fair to say that the story unraveled, or the persona story unraveled as the summer went on. Initially, he claimed to be a Romanian hacker, and some journalists tried to speak to him in Romanian, and he was unable to respond without, it appeared, using Google Translate. So there were elements of the story that immediately didn't add up. And additional forensic investigation have indicated this persona is probably not what he claims to be. And we do have solid evidence in the DNC case more broadly of Russian involvement, in particular, two groups that in cybersecurity we sometimes call APT-28 and APT-29.
So the Russians are good, but not always good. Sometimes they fumble their Romanian.
I'm certainly confident in our ability to do attribution, sir.
And Mr. Weinstein, you referenced in your testimony the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And either now or as a question for the record, could you let us know how we could make that fit into our defense toolbox more effectively against the Russian election manipulation toolbox that has been the subject of this hearing?
Certainly, Senator Whitehouse. It's very simple. We have a law in the books, FARA, that says that we can prosecute people who are unregistered foreign agents if they don't register, but we don't have an ability, at least an effective ability, once we identify a suspected unregistered foreign agent, to actually compel that person to provide records that show whether he is in fact working for a foreign entity or not. That's it. And so there's a thing called the civil investigative demand that would be, it's used in a number of different areas in government investigations, which would be directly applicable here. There have been, I think, twice it's been proposed back in the 90s that the CID authority be added to FARA. It never made it into law. I think given the events of last year, I think there should be a little bit more momentum again to bring that back up. And I think that would help a lot, because that would mean you'd have meaningful investigations on the front end, which would then lead to grand jury investigations, which would lead to prosecutions, which would lead to deterrence and more transparency.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, very much.
Thank you. We'll wrap up now to the panel. You really helped Congress a lot here. I think the Senate understand the nature of the challenge and some of the responses we could take. My main takeaway is that if you forgive and forget Russia, you'll regret it, because they're just only going to get worse. As Mr. Buchanan said, other countries could do the same. Maybe at not the same level, but we want to deter not just Russia. We want to deter other countries like Iran and China have had a checkered past and stuff like this. So here's the state of play. March 8th, Senator Whitehouse and myself wrote a letter to the FBI director and to the Department of Justice. Please provide to us any evidence of a warrant that was issued against the Trump campaign by any court anywhere, or whether or not a warrant was even applied for. We have yet to get a response to our letter. We were told by the FBI today there may be a classified briefing about the contents of this letter. All I am suggesting is that we're to the point now as a nation where the current president has accused the former president of surveilling his campaign, and I'd like to be able to inform the American people whether or not there was any validity to that. And I don't want to compromise sources and methods, but I do believe it's fair to have the government tell us, was a warrant issued? I don't think that's going to compromise sources and methods. To my House colleagues in the Intel Committee, I'm very impressed with the way you're working together. I think the Senate Intelligence Committee is working together very well. They seem to indicate today, the House Intel ranking member and chairman, that there was no evidence of wiretapping. I think they talked about it and danced around it. With all due respect, I appreciate your bipartisanship over there. The letter we wrote wasn't to the House Intel Committee. The letter we wrote was to the Department of Justice and to the FBI. And for the good of the country, I think we need a response from the Department of Justice, from the FBI, so that we can move on. And finally, about a criminal investigation. Director of National Intelligence, the former director, Mr. Clapper, said that during his time, he saw no evidence of collaboration between the Trump campaign and the Russians, and he didn't believe a warrant was issued. If one had been, that he would have known about it. All I am saying, I'd like to get to the bottom of this one way or the other. If there is an investigation covering time periods Mr. Clapper was not in charge of, or there's something new came up, I just want to know about it so we do not run afoul of it. We're not trying to impede an investigation. We're trying to make sure that one can go forward without Congress getting in the way. And the next hearing will be how to protect an investigation from political influence if there is one. So I imagine most Americans would like to know the state of play of what's going on in our country. Count Senator Whitehouse and myself, the subcommittee, to in on the idea that we should provide you more than we provided. Senator Grassley, the chairman, and Feinstein, the ranking member, have been very supportive of the subcommittee's efforts. So there'll be another hearing soon about how to protect an investigation. And hopefully before we have that hearing, we can tell you if there's one to protect. And if there's not one to protect, then maybe we'll change what we look at and how we go forward. So end this with the idea that from my point of view, Russia's out to get us all. They want to divide us in a fashion so that their influence grows at our expense. I believe if we don't act against Russia here in the United States, they're going to be more aggressive in France and Germany. And I also believe they have a pair of twos and we have a full house. That Putin, by his very nature, is a thug and a bully, but Russia is a country that is in the hands of a man who has his self-interest ahead of everybody else's in Russia. I regret that the Russian people are having to live through this. They think he's strong. They think he's tough. Here's what I think. I think he's stolen you blind. I don't know what the Russian president makes, but either he's the best investor in the history of mankind, or he's stealing money if he has anywhere near $40, $60, or $100 billion. I do believe people in Russia who dissent meet a terrible fate, and that he's trying to break the back of NATO and the European Union. And since World War II, there's never been a major conflict on the European continent because of NATO, and it is very much under siege now. And that's to the Ukraine. It's the first time since World War II one nation has, by proxy force, taken the territory claimed by another. And if you don't think this matters to America, you're making a big mistake if you're out there and anywhere in our country. The Ukrainians gave up 1,200 nuclear weapons they owned, the Budapest Accords, with the understanding that they gave up their nuclear arsenal, turned it over to Russia, that their sovereignty would be protected in perpetuity, that Russia would not interfere. And we signed that agreement pledging our support for the concept, if you give up your nuclear weapons, we'll protect you. This is a very big deal. This subcommittee will go wherever the evidence takes it, and to the American people, this is important, worthy of our time as a Senate. To the witnesses, you've done more than I can ever thank you in terms of informing us of what we face as a nation. Stay tuned. Hearing's adjourned.
It's fine, you know.